What's happening here? I asked, scanning the smug faces of my in-laws as they surrounded me. Each one of them wore a look of quiet satisfaction, as though this moment had been carefully orchestrated. They leaned in, clearly savoring every second. Finally, one of them spoke, their voice practically dripping with glee. "We need to talk." I took a deep breath, keeping my composure. "Go ahead," I said, my tone steady. Edgar, my husband, exhaled heavily, his gaze fixed anywhere but on me. "I sold the house to my parents," he said, pausing for effect, "and I think we should get a divorce." The room seemed to pause as my in-laws exchanged triumphant looks. Without missing a beat, I placed the signed divorce papers on the table and slid my wedding ring beside them. "Then I'll be leaving," I said. They were clueless about the consequences of what was unfolding. "I'm Madison. I've just turned 50. It's been years since Edgar and I got married, and now, our children are grown, living their own lives. Once, I worked a regular job, but now, through a friend's encouragement, I found a new path as a teacher of handmade accessories. What started as a hobby has become a fulfilling profession, and I find joy in the creativity and the connections I've made with my students. Some people might think it's foolish to turn a hobby into a livelihood, but I found contentment in it." Edgar and I met when I worked for a company, and he was employed by one of our clients. We started spending more time together at work events, and our relationship blossomed. Eventually, we married for love. 3 years later, we welcomed a healthy, spirited son into our lives. He grew up, attended a prestigious university, and is now happily married, living his own dream. But despite our son's success, the relationship between Edgar and me has deteriorated. Over the years, my husband has changed. The thoughtful, gentle man I married is now demanding and dismissive, treating me more like a servant than a partner. His moods shift unpredictably, and I'm often the target of his anger over trivial matters. Verbal abuse has become more frequent. I've longed to escape, to start fresh, but I'm stuck with an unpaid mortgage. Meanwhile, Edgar quit his job without explanation and now spends his days lounging around the house, leaving me to handle everything. The house we live in was recently rebuilt. I financed the entire project myself, scraping together money bit by bit. This house was meant to be the fulfillment of my dreams, a reflection of my hard work. I didn't want Edgar to take it from me if I left. Besides the mortgage, the house holds too much meaning for me: the spacious kitchen, the design choices I carefully made. Despite Edgar's initial input, I funded everything and had hoped he would respect my vision. In the end, the house became a reality, and it filled me with a sense of pride. However, the cost of rebuilding exceeded our expectations, forcing us to take out a much larger loan than we'd planned. By the time we hit our 50s, we didn't expect to be burdened with such debt, but the promise of our new home kept us going. Edgar, on the other hand, wasn't as thrilled. He grumbled about the design, saying it was a waste of money and not reflecting his wishes. "It's just throwing money away," he'd complain. Over time, his complaints grew quieter, but his childish antics, aimed at provoking me, only intensified. I began to wonder how much longer this would continue. A few months after we'd moved into the house, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. I was about to answer, but Edgar, as if sensing the visitor's identity, beat me to it. Laughter and chatter filled the entrance, and when the living room door opened, I saw my in-laws, Bradel and Emerson, standing there. From the beginning, I always felt a certain pressure in my relationship with them. When Edgar and I first announced our marriage, his parents greeted the news with coldness. They criticized my humble background and treated me with a distant, uncomfortable air, even on our wedding day. Their interference didn't end with the ceremony. It lingered long after, leaving me uncertain about how to navigate our interactions. Just when I thought things had settled, they surprised me with an uninvited visit. I greeted them politely, though I could feel the tension in the air. They walked past me without a word, intentionally bumping my shoulder as they made their way through the house, their silence heavy with disdain. They marveled at the spacious kitchen, their eyes filled with envy. Edgar beamed, proudly showing it off, and as they left, their satisfied expressions told me all I needed to know. But when the door closed behind them, Edgar's demeanor shifted. He turned to me, his face hardening. "Hurry up and prepare tea and snacks," he demanded, his tone sharp. I scrambled to comply, my heart sinking as I hastily prepared the refreshments, but nothing seemed to please his parents. Bradley grumbled under his breath. "Is this the best you can do?" he muttered, his eyes scanning the spread with clear dissatisfaction. They finished quickly, and Bradley offered the only compliment of the visit. "It's quite lovely," he said, more focused on the house's interior than on anything I'd prepared. Edgar, with a broad smile, casually suggested that his parents move in with us. It felt as though I wasn't even there. His words, his joy, all directed toward them. They listened, nodded, and left without a second glance, while I stood frozen, watching their retreating forms. I couldn't ignore the gulf between Edgar and me as he laughed with them, something I hadn't seen in so long. With Edgar's invitation came an unrelenting frequency of visits. At first, it was a few times a month, but then it escalated to several times a week, and before long, it felt as though they were at our house every day. Their criticisms remained unchanged, and Edgar did nothing to stop them. He seemed to grow more distant, more inclined to blame me for everything. My actions, no matter how carefully considered, were always wrong, and his parents' judgment never ceased. He accused me of not listening, of causing our son unnecessary suffering, and the complaints never ended. The weight of it all was crushing, but I remained silent, apologizing when all I wanted was to shout. The visits became so frequent that they began to show up even when I wasn't home. Edgar would bring them over, and their presence left clear marks behind: beer cans littering the counters, empty bottles, and spilled alcohol that stained our new rug. Despite my protests, the house began to reek of liquor, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was no longer the home I'd worked so hard to create. I couldn't understand why Edgar, despite contributing nothing to the household, was so quick to complain. His involvement in gambling added another layer of stress, as used betting slips appeared around the house with alarming regularity. I had tried, countless times, to explain the risks of gambling and the toll it was taking on our finances, but it felt like speaking to a wall. The losses were hitting us hard. One evening, as I watched him shrug off my concerns, I said, "The money you're wasting on gambling is hard-earned through my work. Do you even care?" He didn't respond, just a dismissive shrug. A month had passed since the in-laws began visiting frequently, and they seemed to target the times I was out. One day, however, I returned home early and found them casually lounging in our house. Surprised, I confronted them, trying to keep my voice steady. "What are you doing here?" I asked, tension rising. They exchanged a look, and one of them answered with a snarky edge, "We were just visiting, dear. It's not like you're ever around." Their words stung, and their indifference made it clear they saw my presence as an inconvenience. Frustration and stress built up inside me. I realized I had reached my breaking point. Instead of losing my temper, I decided it was time to take control of the situation. I needed a plan. In the midst of all this, something unusual happened. One day, when I was supposed to be out, the in-laws showed up again. I couldn't help but comment with sarcasm, "Well, isn't this a surprise? You seem to only show up when I'm not here." They ignored my remark and boldly walked in. Edgar greeted them with a smile, leading them through the house, showing them every nook and cranny, from the kitchen to the bathroom. Their scrutiny was unsettling, and I sensed they were looking for something, perhaps even planning something. As they left, their satisfied expressions only deepened my suspicion. They had found what they were looking for. "What was that all about?" I asked Edgar, but he simply shrugged. "None of your business," he muttered, dismissively. I felt a growing unease. There was something he wasn't telling me. I suspected he was hiding something, but I couldn't quite figure it out. All I could do was watch and wait. Then, one evening after work, I came home to find a large moving truck parked in front of our house, bearing the logo of a company called Moving Center. Edgar was speaking with the driver and some representatives. When our eyes met, he pretended not to notice me and disappeared inside. What shocked me even more was the arrival of my in-laws. They casually greeted me, and Edgar, without missing a beat, led them into the house. The atmosphere was thick with tension. As I followed them inside, I saw that the familiar furniture was gone, replaced by my in-laws' outdated pieces, arranged as though this were their home. I sank onto the sofa, surrounded by their smug smiles. It was clear this had been planned. Anxiety churned in my stomach, but I decided to stay quiet and observe. "We need to talk," one of the in-laws said, their voice almost gleeful. I took a deep breath, maintaining a calm facade. "What is it?" I asked, bracing for what was to come. Edgar sighed deeply, his eyes avoiding mine. "I sold the house to my parents," he said, watching me closely before adding, "and I think we should get a divorce." His parents nodded in agreement, their smug expressions widening as though they were savoring the moment. Despite the bombshell, I wasn't shocked. I had expected something like this. Without hesitation, I signed the divorce papers, placed my wedding ring on the table, and said, "Then I'll be leaving." The truth was, I had been growing suspicious of Edgar and his parents' behavior, especially their frequent visits when I wasn't around. To confirm my suspicions, I installed surveillance cameras around the house, synced with my phone. The first few days were uneventful, but then, I discovered something shocking: footage of Edgar and his parents happily discussing the sale of the house. It was time to act. I immediately took steps to transfer the home loan into Edgar's name. If they wanted to push me out of the house, they could take on the responsibility. The $1,900 monthly mortgage had always been paid with my hard-earned salary. I doubted Edgar and his parents could afford it without my financial support, and I had no intention of offering it. With the mortgage now in Edgar's name, I packed up and moved into a new home, furnished with fresh, new furniture. It felt like a weight had been lifted. I was finally free of the toxic environment. ready to start anew and rebuild my life. On my day off, I had looked forward to a quiet day of rest, planning to sleep in until well past noon. Just as I was drifting back to sleep, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. To my shock, Edgar and his parents were standing at my doorstep, uninvited. "What are you doing here?" I asked, blocking their way as they tried to push past me. Without a word, they barged inside, and Edgar slammed a document down in front of me. "You changed the name on the house loan without our permission," he accused, his voice full of indignation. I blinked in disbelief at their sudden arrival. "Yes, I did. After all, you wanted me gone, didn't you?" They looked stunned, before Edgar's mother spoke up, her voice filled with panic. "We're unemployed. We can't afford the monthly payments." Edgar, his face flushed with frustration, raised his voice. "We can't pay that amount." I let out a slow breath, trying to stay calm. "If you don't pay, the interest and late fees will keep increasing. The bank won't care about your situation." Edgar hesitated, but after searching for information on his phone, his face drained of color, his shoulders slumped. "What are we going to do?" his mother murmured, her voice trembling. I shrugged, keeping my tone even. "Maybe look for jobs. It's time for a fresh start." Their expressions grew even more despondent as the reality sank in. They admitted they had no savings or assets. Edgar was buried in gambling debt and had no steady income. They began pleading, their voices laced with desperation. "We've been through so much," Edgar said, his tone attempting sincerity, but it rang hollow. I stood there, unmoved, the weight of the past heavy in the silence. "I'm done," I said firmly. "You made your choice." Without another word, I closed the door, cutting off their pleading. Frustrated, they reported me to the police, and I had to endure the discomfort of their removal from my property. Eventually, due to financial constraints, they were forced to move to a smaller, more affordable apartment on the outskirts of town. Edgar found a part-time job, his income barely enough to support his parents. Meanwhile, my life continued on the same steady course. I focused on my work, finding fulfillment in my job. In my free time, I started a blog dedicated to handmade crafts, which quickly gained attention. Requests to host workshops and teach courses began pouring in, and my monthly income doubled. I had no interest in remarrying. Instead, I embraced the independence I had fought for, building a life on my own terms. One afternoon, while cleaning, I came across an old household account book from the early years of my marriage. The memories of our financial struggles came rushing back, but I felt no regret. With a sense of finality, I placed the book back on the shelf. I had no use for it anymore, my new journey had already begun.